Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Hercule Poirot as he's invited to a country estate for afternoon tea, only to witness a strange occurrence, a porcelain teacup that shattered into pieces. Though it was untouched, and the tea inside was ice cold, stay with me till the end. Because when Poirot pieces that cup back together, he'll find that what broke wasn't porcelain, it was someone's secret, frozen in fear. So, pick up your cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's case is worth every second, until the very end. Chapter 1, The Affair at the Teacup. That shattered cold ephemera morning promised nothing but the ordinary. It was the one on which we found ourselves summoned to the Hartwell estate. The telegram, crisp and precise as though penned by a typist with a personal grudge against superfluity, arrived at my flat with the afternoon post. Poirot, reclining with impeccable posture in his armchair, was already mentally ranging his little gray cells for whatever diversion it might furnish. "It is a matter of shattered appearances, mon ami," he observed, turning the telegram over with the same care a connoisseur gives to the examining of a precious jewel. "The word affair intrigues me. There is drama. Yes, we go." Hartwell was one of those country places that wears its wealth like a well-tailored coat, evident, unostentatious, and with the right amount of history stitched into its very stones. The drive was lined with chestnuts, their leaves whispering secrets in the gentle breeze. And on arrival we were met by the butler, Mr. Blythe, a man whose smooth courtesy seemed to conceal some inner tension, as if the polished surface were stretched to taut over uncertain ground. The company in the drawing-room was small but unmistakably composed. Lady Agatha Fenwick, the proprietress of the house, sat upright on a fainting couch with an expression of brittle composure. Her daughter, Miss Eleanor Fenwick, had the pallor of someone who kept too many things hidden behind practiced smiles. There was Dr. Percival Mead, a physician, whose credentials were as impeccable as his manner was distant, and Colonel Arthur Prentice, a retired military man with a jaw that suggested habitually set decisions. Lastly, there was Mr. Oliver Swan, a publisher with an eager gaze and a charm that, according to Poirot's flicker of attention, was a studied thing, worn like the latest style rather than a reflection of the self. The atmosphere, as I remember it, was that of velvet draped over something that might bruise should pressure be applied. It was Lady Agatha who spoke first, her voice precise, almost brittle. It was in the library. She began that the incident took place. "My husband deceased for 2 years. Thank you, had a teacup, an old Chinese porcelain piece. It is a family heirloom. This morning, when Eleanor went to fetch it for the luncheon, she found it shattered on the carpet, and beneath it, Lord Fenwick's will newly revised, and missing the final page." Poirot inclined his head slightly, a smile not yet formed, but anticipated in the way his eyes narrowed with pleasure, at a puzzle being laid before him. "And the will, it is important to note, was hidden beneath the cup." "The cup, it shattered ostensibly of its own will, and the page it is only missing, or has it been removed?" Miss Eleanor's fingers twined around the arm of her chair. "Removed. The butler says he found the rest of the will in the safe. The final page, the one that made provisions for a certain unexpected beneficiary, was gone. There's a beneficiary who is unexpected." Poirot tapped his cane lightly on the rug. "Ah, mon cher Hastings, do you not feel the coldness already? We have here a shattered teacup and a vanishing page. Very well. Who else knew of this revision?" Lady Agatha hesitated for the smallest increment of time. "One of those moments, Poirot, is so keen to trap like a fly in amber. Only myself, Eleanor, and Percival. Oliver saw the draft last week when he was here to speak with my husband about the memoirs. Dr. Mead, a man with the practiced calm of one trained to observe but remained detached, gave a slow nod. The revisions were minor, except for the last edition. I must confess, Lady Agatha, I was surprised. Lord Fenwick had been, in certain private regards, unpredictable. Colonel Prentice, who had been studying the room with a soldier's careful eye, cleared his throat. The question is why now? The will has sat unchanged since his passing. Why would someone disturb it this particular morning? And why hide the page under a teacup? The drama of it suggests intentionality, or accident dressed as drama, Mr. Swan said, and his smile flickered too quickly, as if the word had been rehearsed. Poirot rose and walked to the window, placing his fingers together as if in prayer. But his gaze was scanning the lines of the room. The library is small, is it not? The teacup is of fine porcelain. The shattering makes noise. Who heard it? Who found it first? It was Eleanor, Lady Agatha answered, and she insists she heard nothing. Ah. Poirot turned, his small mustaches twitching imperceptibly. Mon ami, if the teacup fell, it would have made a sound, Nest's pause. If there was no sound heard, perhaps it was arranged. The page, removed, suggests a purpose. The purpose, perhaps, to hide something, yes, but to hide it under the very object that announces itself by breaking. There is something contradictory. That is delicious, I confess. At that moment, I felt that peculiar prickling a sensation one feels when a surface has just begun to crack, and the whole thing might fall apart with the slightest additional pressure. Poirot, for his part, was serenely absorbed, as though listening to a symphony in which he alone could distinguish the discordant note that everyone else was missing. Who would benefit if that final page were gone? Poirot asked, but the question was not so much a question as an opening salve, inviting each of them to reveal, through their manner of not answering, their own little reveals. Miss Eleanor's eyes drifted to the window, as if the trees beyond held a secret she could borrow. It was supposed to leave a certain sum to someone the family did not approve of, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Someone disapproved of by the family, Poirot repeated. And the family is a broad term. Does it include the young lady herself? Yes? She started, the motion small but noticeable. I would not go that far, she murmured. Of course not, mademoiselle. Poirot's eyes, sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, moved from face to face. We shall see. But for the moment, I must know, who has handled the teacup in the last 24 hours? The responses were careful, overlapping, and, as one expected, not entirely consistent, each with shades and shadows. I watched Poirot, I watched the others, and I felt the first invisible threads of the web begin to tighten, unseen but inexorably drawing nearer to the inevitable entanglement. There was one thing. I knew that Poirot had not yet said aloud. He had not made any declaration. That, I would later understand, was because the real business of the day was not the shattered porcelain nor even the missing page. It was the people, how they moved, what they chose to conceal, and, above all, the peculiar chill that had entered the room, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Very well, Poirot concluded softly, with that unsettling calm of a fisherman who knows the fish is on the line and is merely allowing it to tire itself before the reveal. We will begin. The little gray cells will work, and you will all know soon enough that the truth has its own way of coming to light. But first, mon ami, we examine the scene. Chapter 2. Early inconsistency. Sporto never rushed into matters that were not yet ripe. We went, as he had said, to examine the library. It was a room of dark oak panels, heavy curtains drawn back to admit a pale, diffused light, and shelves of leather-bound volumes, all of which gave one the impression of weight both intellectual and emotional. The teacup lay where Eleanor had described it, 3 porcelain fragments scattered like broken snow, the pattern of blue vines interrupted by jagged white. The carpet beneath bore a faint, damp discoloration, as though something cold had been laid there and then withdrawn. Poirot crouched with the grace of a dancer and scanned the fragments with an intensity that made even the worn mahogany seem to feel observed. I, as his chronicler and sometimes participant, took in the room in the more pedestrian way of noting obvious things: the fall of the light, the position of the furniture, the slight indent in the rug near the writing desk. But it was Poirot who caught the nuances, those little deviations from the expected, the filaments of detail that would later knot together. "Tell me, Hastings," he said, rising and smoothing his jacket, "what is most unusual about this scene?" "That the teacup is broken and yet no one heard it fall," I offered, recalling Lady Agatha's statement, "and that the will's last page is gone." We, Poirot gestured with a finger. "But that is too large," to announced. "There are smaller things. Look at the fragments." He picked up a piece with gloved fingers, turning it under his own reflection in the window. "Note the edge here. The break is clean, yes, but this piece has a slight smear, a grayish mark. It is not from the cup itself. It is not part of the glaze. It is dust, and yet it is fresh. There is the smell of it as well. Smell, mon ami, is sometimes neglected. It is of the paper. The cup has been set upon the will not long after it was placed, for the dust has not settled." I peered closer. So the cup, and with it, the will, was placed together deliberately. Then why the shattering? To draw attention? Perhaps, or perhaps to divert. And look here, he tapped the carpet. There's an impression, flattened fibers on the left side, as though someone had knelt. But the right side, there is no corresponding impression. The person, when placing the cup, was not balanced. They favored one side. That tells us something of their physicality, which we shall keep, yes. Also, his eyes flicked toward the writing desk. The desk, Hastings. See the paperweight? Its position has been shifted slightly. The drawer is locked. No one has opened it. Yet there is the faint outline of a finger's smudge on the brass knob, the kind that appears when one has been twisting it in thought. Someone considered opening the drawer, then changed their mind, I suggested, or someone wanted it to appear as if they had. Misdirection, perhaps. The trick is to know if they want us to believe something that is not true, or if they are deceiving themselves. While Poirot was speaking, Miss Eleanor entered the room again. She had been asked to remain nearby, to be available should any further recollection surface. Her steps hesitated when she saw us bent over the wreckage, and I noted the slight flush in her cheeks that the air had not yet cooled. "You asked me to come back?" she said, voice wavering but composed. "Yes, mademoiselle. You are of interest to the investigation. I have a question. When you first saw the teacup, did you touch anything? Did you move the fragments? The will?" She shook her head. "No, I found it as it is. I only lifted the larger piece to see if the pattern matched the base. There was no sound, Monsieur Poirot, nothing. I thought perhaps the servants had placed it there, and that the page was missing before I came. And the will, mademoiselle, was it so fresh? Had the ink dried completely? There was a slight smell of fresh ink. It had the look of something revised not long ago. The new line about the beneficiary was in a different hand. Mother says Lord Fenwick's handwriting was peculiar, but this looked sharper, as if written with intention. Poirot's eyes lingered on her, not in suspicion so much as in measurement. "You said the cup was placed. You do not recall moving it. When a person sees something broken unexpectedly, they often touch, they test. You did not. That means you were convinced the arrangement was there for you to see. That is interesting. Merci." We turned our attention to the will's remaining portion. It had been taken from the safe, Lady Agatha's safe, which stood in the adjoining study by Mr. Blythe. He had produced the document wrapped in linen, the edges crisp, but with a faint curl on the right that indicated recent handling. Poirot opened it with the care of a priest revealing sacred script. "Note," he murmured, "the ink here is of two sorts. The earlier paragraphs have a slightly faded tone. The addition the last part has a different pressure, heavier, as if the writer was emphasizing something. The language changes, more personal. And mon Dieu, Hastings, see the blot. It is on the margin, not hidden to the unobservant. A hand that trembles slightly when it writes something that bears weight. The person who wrote that part was under emotional influence. Could it be Eleanor's? I ventured. She is young and perhaps sentimental. Poirot did not answer directly. He simply turned and, with that small movement of his head, suggested observation without accusation. We will not jump. The little gray cells do not like haste. As the morning advanced, Poirot called for the servants to be assembled outside the library. He questioned Mr. Blythe firstly about the routine, who had keys, what times the library was visited, if there had been any unusual comings or goings. Blythe, smooth and practiced in his responses, admitted to only the regular traffic, Lady Agatha in consultation, Mr. Swan looking over manuscripts, and the occasional visit of Colonel Prentice for his quiet reading. He denied hearing any noise, and yet, when Poirot asked him to describe how the teacup should normally sit upon the small side table, his hand trembled the barest fraction. Poirot's gaze, as I watched, kept returning to the safe's locked face. It was a thing of security, yes, but the lock itself had minute wear on one side, as if often turned by the same fingers, a detail that spoke more of habit than of the extraordinary event we were analyzing. You see, Poirot said to me quietly, there is a rhythm to the house. Nest's pause. The rhythm is broken by something. The broken teacup is the loud sound, but beneath, the silence tells more. There's a person who would benefit from confusion, but remember, Hastings, confusion is like mist. It hides, but also reveals if one watches where it thins. The impression the room left upon me was that of a surface faintly cracked, with pressure building beneath. Each inconsistency, each small shift in posture, every hesitation in speech, seemed less a random quirk than a carefully placed note in a larger composition. Poirot, the conductor, had merely begun to tap his baton. The symphony was not yet heard, but the tension, the expectation, was already in the air. Chapter 3. The gathering of suspects drawing room was prepared that afternoon for what Poirot delicately called la réunion. The phrase, I soon discovered, was his own way of softening what might otherwise be a stern confrontation. In truth, it was an assembly, a closing of the circle, a subtle tightening of the net. He insisted that all present in the house at the time the affair unfolded be gathered, not merely those who appeared directly implicated. One must know the shape of the whole. Hastings, he said, before discerning the shadow within. Lady Agatha, pale save for the small embarrassed color that flared and receded like a flushed cameo when attention turned toward her, sat near the fireplace. Miss Eleanor was beside her, the practiced calm of her earlier appearance wearing thin around the edges. One saw in the small tremor of her fingers a kind of internal battle between wanting to speak and wishing to remain contained. Dr. Meade had taken his place with the polite distance of a man who measures himself in degrees and keeps emotion at a quiet temperature. Colonel Prentice had, in his own way, assumed the role of sentinel, stiff-backed, observant, the gaze of one who measures angles of suspicion. Mr. Oliver Swan lounged with a casualness that seemed more effort than ease, a smile fixed like a mask with cracks around the eyes. Mr. Blythe stood at the periphery, the servant whose knowledge was both invaluable and constrained by duty. Poirot entered with his usual measured pace, his little gray cells already churning. He had on his face the slightest curve that suggested amusement at the complexity of the human heart. He did not begin with accusations. Instead, he gave each person a moment, a turn of light in their direction, a small nod, a pause that set them comfortably off balance without forcing them to falter. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, hands folded, We are together because a confusion has visited this house. A teacup broken. A page vanishing. A family with its particular arrangements. I do not wish at first to speak of guilt. I prefer to speak of the truth, as it is. But before the truth may be seen, one must understand the fabric upon which it lies. He gave his attention first to Lady Agatha. You, madam, have the burden of legacy. You are the keeper of the past and, perhaps, of its surprises. You tell me the last page contained an unexpected provision. To whom was this provision meant to go? Lady Agatha's lips pressed together. It was to be for Mr. Theodore Carmichael. He was a friend of my late husband's from years ago. He is not of our social sphere. That is why it was a surprise that might be resented, Poirot murmured. He then turned to Miss Eleanor. And you, mademoiselle, did you know of Mr. Carmichael? Eleanor's fingers tightened around the small embroidered cushion in her lap. Only that he had been mentioned once in a letter. I do not know much. Father kept such things private. He trusted Mother, and perhaps, unjustly, that trust has built walls where windows should be. Poirot's gaze flicked to Dr. Mead. Doctor, you observed the revision. You sensed emotion in the script. Lord Fenwick's intentions changed. Do you think this was of his own volition, or was there influence? Dr. Mead's response was careful, precise. He was a man of moods. He held on to certain affections with a tenacity that surprised even those close to him. I cannot say if he would have altered a will for whim, but the pressure in that writing there was a tenderness and something akin to guilt. He wrote as one who wished to make amends, perhaps to someone he felt he had wronged. Interesting. Poirot said softly, And you, Colonel Prentice, what is your connection to Lord Fenwick? The colonel had been a neighbor for many years. Lady Agatha interjected before Prentice could reply, as if to give context. He was a close adviser in small matters and also acted as a sort of family stabilizer. During the unsettled years, Colonel Prentice inclined his head. Lord Fenwick and I shared a mutual respect. I was not involved in the private these affairs. My concern is with the maintenance of order, the disturbance of the will, the spectacle of a shattered heirloom. That is disorder, and that affects everyone in the vicinity. Poirot's small mustaches twitched. And Mr. Swan, he continued, turning to the publisher, you are here about memoirs. Does the writing of a life, Monsieur Swan, ever make one feel protective, perhaps jealous, over who receives its legacy? Swan's smile remained, but a light flitted briefly in his eyes and awareness of the question's double edge. A legacy is a story, Monsieur Poirot. Stories have markets, and markets have interested parties. I was here to record. I had no authority. Any interest in the disposition of fortune would be, naturally, secondary to the telling. Poirot said, the telling and the hearing, they are brothers in a way. And you, Mr. Blythe, what counts for your loyalty? To the family? To the truth? To the order of the house? The order of the house, sir, Blythe replied, voice smooth, but with the tiniest crack that betrayed the strain of the question. I serve those in it, and I report what I see. I have not seen much, except what I have already said. I have nothing to hide. Poirot allowed the silence to sit for a moment, letting the weight shift imperceptibly among them. You see, he said to me quietly so that only I might hear, the foundation is laid. Each one thinks they know their part. The question is, who has written, unseen, a different scene upon it? Then, louder, addressing all, there is someone among you who believes that confusion will cloak their intention. But confusion is not a veil. It is a mirror. You show us by what you hide, what you wish us not to see. I watched as the small ripple of unease, barely perceptible in the twitch of a lip or the tightening of a jaw, passed over the assembled faces. None of them broke, none of them confessed, but each had shifted, whether inwardly or outwardly, in response to Poirot's calm pressure. That, I have learned in the years with him, is often more revealing than an overt outburst. He concluded the gathering by saying, "We shall proceed. Each small detail has its place. You will each have time to speak more, to reveal more if you wish. For now, I thank you for your patience. The little gray cells are warming, and they are listening." Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. It was not that Poirot had not been present before. Rather, this was the moment he formally stepped from observer to orchestrator. Until then, he had been the quiet current beneath the surface, allowing the others to present themselves, to show, without overt interference, their rhythms and fractures. Now he assumed the center, and one felt the change as a conductor lifts his baton, and the orchestra, whether aware or not, alters its listening. He entered the room after luncheon, having taken his time over his tea and having, as I later learned, sent for certain items, small mirrors, a notebook, and a magnifying glass, objects he referred to as companions of the little gray cells. He wore that expression that was so peculiar to him, an air of gentle amusement, overlaid with an iron precision. He did not sit immediately. Instead, he walked among the group, his eyes skimming the faces not with accusation, but with the measured curiosity of one reading a familiar book and discovering new annotations in the margins. "Amos," he said with a small gesture that made even the ordinary sound of his voice have weight. "We will now speak of what the others have called the theory." He paused, letting the words settle. "The official version, that someone, perhaps in desperation, broke the teacup, that the page was misplaced by accident, that the confusion is a cloud without design." He let the silence that followed hang just long enough to be uncomfortable, not cruelly, but with that precise touch that makes one feel their own thought under scrutiny. Lady Agatha spoke quickly. "It would seem the simplest explanation, Monsieur Poirot. A servant, perhaps, mishandled the cup. The missing page perhaps misplaced during the revisions. Simple is not always truth, madam." Poirot turned, very slightly, toward Colonel Prentice. "Colonel, you said earlier that disorder affects everyone. Perhaps, then, the disorder here is manufactured to draw attention away from something more subtle." Prentice's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Disorder can be a deliberate tactic. I do not think the family would have wanted scandal, and yet something scandalous has been made to appear." Poirot inclined his head. "And what of the notion that the will's alteration and the breaking of the cup are separate? That one is the noise and one the whisper? It is the belief of the authorities that the noise is the cause and the whisper a consequence. I am of a different opinion." Miss Eleanor, who had been quiet, murmured, "You think they are connected?" "Ah, mademoiselle, I do not think. I observe. Connection is a pattern. Pattern is a conversation between things. The cup and the page, they speak to each other not in words, but in placement. One is not noise that hides the other. One is the stage upon which the other is performed." Dr. Mead, who had retained a careful objectivity, ventured, "You imply that the destruction of the cup was intentional, to make us look at it instead of the missing page." "Exactement." Poirot's small mustaches trembled with satisfaction. "It is like dressing a man in bright clothing so that the eyes are drawn there, while the hands pick the pocket unseen. The attention falls where the designer wants it. But there are small things. The person who placed the cup, did they wish us to see the page, or to believe we saw nothing at all?" "Then what happened?" Mr. Swan asked, leaning slightly forward as if drawn in by the newly lit thread. "Was the cup a distraction or a message? Was the missing page meant to be hidden or revealed?" "It is both," Poirot replied simply. "The person who makes the mistake of believing that a thing is either one or the other has already lost. The cup was placed to appear an accident, the removal of the page to be blamed upon that accident. But the person is clever, and cleverness always carries a guide, the weakness, and it is my work to find it." He then turned toward Mr. Blythe. "You, monsieur, have seen many things. You know the rhythm of the house. Did anything strike you irregular?" A visiting are not observed. A step heavier than usual. A silence, perhaps, when there should have been sound. Blythe, who had the smooth reflexes of someone trained to answer before being asked, noted carefully only that the safe key was handled slightly differently. The lock was turned with the same hand as always, but there was a slight pause, as if the person hesitated. And afterwards, Lady Agatha's maid fetched a different tea blend than usual. That is all, sir. Poirot's eyes narrowed a fraction. A pause, yes. Hesitation before or after? That is the question. The tea blend interesting. One part of the house serves comfort. Another, it observes what comfort masks. He moved to the fireplace, leaning slightly on the mantel in an attitude of relaxed intent, then turned to all of them as if unveiling a gentle truth. The official theory is that the accident was simple, that the cup fell, the page was lost, and we are to mourn misfortune. I say that this idea is a comfortable blanket to keep one from feeling the chill beneath. The truth is not comfortable. It has sharp edges. It is not in the falling of a cup. It is in why the cup was there at that moment, who had motivation to shift its place, and what the missing page contained that required such dramatic accompaniment. I felt, as he spoke, a subtle shifting among the group, not a reaction of guilt laid bare, but a rearrangement of internal defenses. Poirot, of course, saw it all. He always did. That was the marvel of him, not the loud confession, but the small rebalancing, the micro-movement of a posture altered by the recognition that something more was being perceived than before. He concluded the session with a small smile that had nothing of levity. We continue. I shall speak with each of you more fully. There are contradictions in stories told, and also absences, silences that shout. The little gray cells are not idle. You will not yet know what they know, but you will feel their presence, yes? We shall meet again soon. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. Poirot began the interviews with a method that, to the uninitiated, might have seemed casual. To those who understood him, it was a surgical opening. He preferred to take them individually, in the quiet of small rooms, away from the weight of the group, so that each person might relax their guard and, in that relaxation, reveal what they believed they were concealing. I was with him when he first called in Lady Agatha. The sitting room adjacent to the library had been arranged with 2 armchairs, a small table, and a decanter of sherry untouched. Lady Agatha entered with a poised grace that, upon close inspection, bore under it a weariness like an old velvet soft, but with thinning where pressure had long been applied. Madam, Poirot began, his voice soft, you are burdened by legacy. Tell me, when you first decided to revise the will, what was the thought that troubled you? She clasped her hands around the cup of tea, the porcelain warm against her fingers. My husband, in his last years, he spoke often of mistakes. He was proud, and pride made him blind to certain wrongs. He had grown close, in secret, to Mr. Carmichael. It was a friendship older than our society permitted. He wished to give something back, to make right with a man who had been loyal without claim. And loyalty without claim is a dangerous thing to reward, perhaps, in the eyes of others. Poirot asked gently. Lady Agatha looked down. Yes, it would have upset the balance. It would have felt like betrayal to some. I did not agree with all of it, but I understood. That is why the last page was kept private for so long. Was there anyone who protested? Anyone who knew and was unhappy? She hesitated, the smallest pause, before saying, Eleanor questioned, as daughters do. The sudden mention of an outsider. Colonel Prentice advised caution. Mr. Swan he did not advise. He observed with interest in the story that might come. Dr. Meade spoke of health, not of inheritance. No one protested strongly. They nodded, and life returned to its rhythm. Poirot's eyes, subtle as ever, noted the slight lift of her chin when she said Swan observed with interest. It was not accusation. It was placement. Next was Miss Eleanor. Poirot had her sit facing the window, so the light, and her own reflection, softened what she showed outwardly. He did not begin with the will. He began with the teacup. "Mademoiselle," he said pleasantly, "when you went into the library, you found the cup broken. Tell me what you felt before you lifted the piece. Did you feel surprise, fear?" "I felt confusion," she replied, voice low. It was as if the room held its breath. The cup did not look like it had fallen by accident. It seemed placed, but the placement was wrong, too deliberate to be casual, too clumsy to be natural. "And did you think of who would wish to appear clumsy?" She flushed slightly. "No, Monsieur Poirot. I was thinking of who would wish to distract." He did not push. Instead, he leaned back, rubbing his chin with satisfaction. "And the beneficiary, the outsider, did you like the idea? Did you think it strange?" "I thought," she said slowly, "that perhaps father was trying to rewrite his own story, that he was trying to make things right where he had been wrong. I also thought it would upset the house. That was the part that frightened me. Not the gift, but the ripple." Dr. Mead's interview followed. He sat with his hands folded, the posture of a man who had been trained to listen more than to speak. Yet in the small tremor of his fingers I saw the internal calculation. Poirot asked him about the writing, the pressure, the emotional influence, not directly about the will, but about Lord Fenwick's moods in the weeks prior. He had been uneasy. Dr. Mead confessed after a moment, not in illness, but in thought. He spoke of obligations not fulfilled, of debts not monetary. He would sometimes sit for long periods, looking at papers, and then closing them abruptly. He mentioned regret. I do not know to whom. He was secretive, but not deceptive. There is a difference. Was there anyone who brought him comfort, or perhaps made him feel guilty? Poirot asked. He kept company, in whispers, with the idea of making amendment. There was a woman, no, not a woman directly. A cause. He referred vaguely to bridging a gap. It was unclear to me if the gap was emotional, moral, or social. That is why I said there was tenderness and guilt. It was not one thing. It was many, layered. Colonel Prentice was next. He was less forthcoming, but that was his nature. Poirot gently prodded at his sense of order, asking whether the spectacle might serve more than simply to displace. Something is being covered. Yes, Prentice conceded. The vanity of the broken cup draws the eye. The missing page would have been noticed, perhaps, if not for the drama. It is an old tactic: create noise to prevent the hearing of the whisper. Who, in your estimation, would have the ability to orchestrate such noise while keeping the whisper hidden? Poirot asked, his tone mild. A person who knows the house, someone who understands its rhythms, someone close enough to move pieces without suspicion. That is all I can say. Mr. Swan's questions were the most delicate. Poirot spoke of stories and markets, of the temptation to shape narratives. Swan answered with ease, yet Poirot, with the little pauses between his replies, caught the slight recalibration of his words when he was pressed about why he was interested in the memoirs. You said you had no authority, Monsieur Swan, Poirot observed. Yet when one records a life, one chooses what to place emphasis on. Did you, while here, learn anything that altered your view of the man whose story you were to tell? Swan gave a smile that did not reach his eyes entirely. I learned that even the most controlled lives have fractures, and that those fractures are sometimes precious because they are true. Finally, Poirot spoke with Mr. Blythe. The butler was precise, but now I detected a cautiousness, a slight guarding, as if he were trying not to overextend and thus expose something unintended. You know, Blythe, Poirot said softly, that the turning of a key with hesitation is not always indecision. It can be performance. Who benefits if we think one hesitates? Who suffers if the hesitation is believed to be weakness? Blythe's face, like all well-trained masks, gave nothing, yet I saw, as Poirot saw. The flicker too small for another to notice of the tightening around the jaw. I serve the house. Blythe replied, I report as I see. And you do not wish to mislead? I wish to be accurate, Ehlers. Poirot nodded. We shall see. He closed the interviews gently, without fanfare, but with the accumulating weight of quiet knowledge. As they ended, I saw the pattern becoming less a scatter and more an outline each interview a stroke. Some light, some dark, building toward a picture that was not yet complete, but showing its contours with increasingly undeniable clarity. Chapter 6, First false lead the next morning, brought with it a slight shift in the air of Hartwell Estate. The previous day's tension had not lessened. It had congealed, forming small pockets of suspicion and alliance in quiet corners. Poirot, as always, was composed, but I saw the glint in his eyes sharpen an indication that the little gray cells had unearthed a direction worthy of examination. He had asked the local magistrate to send for Inspector Larner from the nearby town, a man of official bearing, convinced that the appearance of legal authority would give weight to the first theory. To be tested, it was, as Poirot had intimated, a necessary misdirection to flush out the reactions of the others. Inspector Larner arrived with a crisp efficiency. He had a ready acceptance of the obvious. The teacup had been broken by one of the servants. In a clumsy accident, the missing page mislaid in the confusion. And the person to be questioned most closely was Mr. Oliver Swan. Larner had taken the publisher's earlier presence, his opportunistic interest in memoirs, and the way he had lingered near private documents as justification. Swan, for his part, had been careless the day before in a way that, under the magnifying glass of official suspicion, bloomed into seemingly damning evidence. It began with a small revelation from the housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, who had been brought in by Larner to corroborate the comings and goings. She produced a scrap of paper found, so she claimed, in Mr. Swan's writing room, a draft of a letter addressed, not to Lord Fenwick, but to someone else, referencing the necessity of ensuring that stories remain in the right hands and containing a line that could be interpreted as, the distraction will permit the alteration to go unseen. Swan protested, of course, that the scrap had been taken out of context, that it was an editorial note, a fragment of metaphor, but the inspector, and some among the household, found it convenient, and the momentum gathered like a snowball rolling downhill. Poirot, who had been present for the reading of the scrap, allowed the accusation to swell around Swan. He watched the publisher's face, the coloration, the small nervous adjustments of his gloves, the little swallow in his throat. I could see, as I had learned to see with experience, the momentary tightening of a thought, the instinctive rallying that people make when they feel the net closing. Swan, pressed by Larner's direct questioning, admitted to having written the note, but claimed its meaning had been about the publication rights of Lord Fenwick's memoirs, not about wills or teacups. A writer always places emphasis where the narrative will hold, he said. It was a metaphor for controlling the narrative after he is gone. Nothing more. The inspector, satisfied with the confession of obscure intent, announced that Mr. Swan would be temporarily held for further questioning. The family reacted, some with relief for a direction, others with unease at how quickly things were being decided. Miss Eleanor's lips pressed tight. I could see she believed something, though what that was, I could not yet say. Lady Agatha said little. Her expression had become practiced in reserving judgment until public and private lines blurred. Dr. Mead's eyes, which usually remained calm, had a flicker of concern. Colonel Prentice muttered about the necessity of decisive action to restore order. Poirot did not intervene immediately. He allowed the spotlight to burn on Swan. It was, as he later told me in private, a test. He had seen the note, yes, and he had seen the instinctive reaction. But the way the note had been presented, the choice of language, the timing, and the readiness with which the household accepted the conclusion all these things were like threads pulled to see which would resist. Swan, when brought into the small study for further interrogation, grew defensive. "I am being made a scapegoat," he said, with a certain bitterness. "I am a storyteller, yes, but the idea that I would manipulate a will through such an elaborate—" He stopped himself, seeing the slight smile that played at the corner of Poirot's mouth. "I have been involved with many lives in ink. I have no need to ruin mine by such foolery." "You are a man who understands the power of implication," Poirot remarked gently. "You also understand the pleasure of being believed. That makes you both dangerous and, in small matters, telltale. The question is not whether you would do it, but whether you have been made to appear as if you did. The difference is important." Swan stared, and I could see the flicker of doubt cross his features, not in his guilt, but in the possibility that he had been manipulated, used as the visible piece while something else moved unseen behind him. The inspector, feeling bolstered, prepared to present Swan's apparent involvement to the family. It had the effect of injecting the conversation with a measure of satisfaction, a certain settling of the nerves that comes when a direction is found, however tenuous. That was the danger, Poirot later told me. Once the mind seizes upon a solution, it begins to lean on it, to smooth its edges and ignore the misfits. It was then that I observed Miss Eleanor step quietly to the window, her figure framed in the washed light. She was speaking in low tones to Dr. Mead, and their faces were close. I could not hear the words, but I could see the movement of Dr. Mead's head slight, a tilt of consideration. Eleanor's fingers toyed with the curtain, twisting the hem, a nervous habit perhaps, or a distraction from what she was thinking. The placing of Mr. Swan in the center did not, I perceived, satisfy her. It unsettled her, but not because she believed he was innocent. Rather, it suggested to her that something more elaborate was being concealed by the crowding of attention. On the obvious, Poirot's expression remained impenetrable as the official narrative built momentum. Later, when I asked him about it, he said, "The person who wants to be seen will have a very different mark than the one who does not. The false lead is a gift, Hastings. It shows us, by its acceptance, where the hunger for closure lies. The real work is in the resistance to its comfort." So the household settled, for the moment, round the idea that Mr. Swan's involvement, while not fully proved, had some neat edges that fit the chapter the authorities wished to write. I, for one, felt the unease of the things that don't quite fit sensation. Poirot felt it too, but as always, he sat with it, feeding it into the little gray cells, allowing the false lead to breathe, to stretch, to reveal where it was thin and where the real shape, still unseen, might lie. Chapter 7. The psychological gamma. The parent solution had settled like a temporary bomb over Hartwell, Mr. Swan the convenient focal point, the family allowing themselves, in small murmurs, to believe the worst and thus feel they were nearer to order. It was then that Poirot began his work in earnest, not by overturning what had been said, but by placing little seeds of doubt in the minds of those who felt comforted. He did not accuse. He questioned. He did not push. He suggested. It was, as he once described to me, the art of seeing the truth emerge of its own accord, like a fish taking the bait because it believes it is food. He started with Colonel Prentice. The colonel was a man accustomed to directness, and Poirot, with a delicate and almost conspiratorial tone, began to speak of the nature of apparent victories. "Colonel," he said one afternoon, while we sat with him in the green morning room, "when a man is accused and another hands him the blame, do you not think the bones of that accusation are examined by the others? They look for comfort. They say, 'Ah, now the shape has been found.' But the person who breathes relief first is not always innocent. Sometimes they are simply grateful the disturbance has stopped pointing toward themselves." Prentice shifted slightly. You mean to suggest someone's relief is a mask? I mean to suggest, Poirot answered gently, that relief reveals where the knife was aimed. One does not breathe easy when danger still circles. The person who offered the easiest acceptance of Mr. Swan's implication, did they do so because they were confident or because they had interest in the story not changing? Prentice's fingers, which had been resting on the arms of the chair, tightened imperceptibly. Order is needed, he said, more defense than explanation. Order, oui. But is it a true order or a staged one? The mind, when it is hungry for closure, takes the prettiest answer and dresses it as the final truth. Next, Poirot turned his attention toward Miss Eleanor by design. Not in confrontation, but in collaboration. He asked her to walk with him in the garden. The roses had just begun to pale at the edges from the heat. Their scent mingled with the faint metallic tang of the morning's earlier conversation. He spoke of the idea of distraction, how something loud can make the quiet seem safe, you say. Poirot observed that the cup was both deliberate and clumsy. That is a curious combination, non? Who wishes to be seen, but in a way that looks accidental? That is the work of a mind that desires to control how others look, while keeping their own hand hidden. Eleanor was silent for a moment, her gaze traveling to the distant terrace and back. The household wants a story, Monsieur Poirot, she said steadily. They want neatness. They want the comfort that comes from having a villain. The fact that Mr. Swan could be one, it settles the air. But I feel the pull of something else. The way you speak of distraction. It is like the room is breathing around the obvious. Oui, Poirot replied, eyes soft but bright. You see, that is why I speak. The person who creates the noise wishes you to believe the noise is the crime. But in the pauses between, the real movement is made. You are a watcher, mademoiselle, whether you wish it or not. The game is not to accuse now, but to notice who grows still when others speak, who shifts when comfort is offered. He let her go with a small nod, planting in her mind the idea that she too was being watched, not by him with accusation, but by the pattern, and that her own unease might yield something when released at the right moment. Poirot's next maneuver involved Dr. Mead and Lady Agatha together. He invited them for tea, and as the kettle hissed and the steam unfurled like whispering advice, he spoke of the emotional layers of Lord Fenwick's revision. He asked Lady Agatha about guilt, asking her to consider whether the desire to correct a wrong could become a weapon in skilled hands. You have two burdens, Poirot said, pouring the tea with a delicate hand. One is to protect the legacy of the man you loved. The other is to protect yourself from the consequences of that love. When someone is given a possibility to make amends, the temptation is to justify methods. Does the desire to right a wrong ever become a pressure to hide the means, madam? She took a sip, the tea trembling slightly in the cup. We all adjust stories to fit our conscience, she said slowly. Sometimes the adjustment is small, and sometimes it becomes the entire piece. And you, doctor? He turned to Mead. Do you see in such adjustments the shadow of another's influence? A man writing with guilt, does he do so freely? Or is there someone who has whispered to him that such guilt is deserved, and so he believes he must hide? Dr. Mead was thoughtful. A man can convince himself he chooses correction, when, in fact, the idea has been comforted into place. Regret can be nurtured by suggestion. Ah, Poirot said, and suggestion is a gentle poison. It is not only what one says, but what one leads another to think they have thought themselves. The psychological game set the household's internal gears turning. Poirot wasn't revealing the truth. He was drawing out the edges of those who would shape the story to their benefit, and watching how they flinched, adjusted, or doubled down. Each conversation was a small push, an invitation to show a crack. Some responded with deflection, some with the tightening of smiles. Others, like a tremor in the foundation, betrayed a deeper unease. It was during these quiet machinations that I began to see, not a single culprit, but a lattice of motives, supports, and contradictions. The first false lead had been embraced too eagerly. Now, through whispered questions and carefully placed observations, Poirot was turning the warmth of complacency into the uncomfortable knowledge of a truth, still waiting to be fully articulated. Chapter 8. A secondary mysterygist. When the household allowed itself the uneasy comfort of a direction, a new disturbance arrived, not loud like the breaking of porcelain, but sharp and precise, the kind that pricked awareness like a needle in soft skin. It began with Lady Agatha's maid, Marianne, who, pale and trembling, sought out Poirot in the corridor. She carried, wrapped in a handkerchief, a small object that at first glance seemed trivial, a silver tea strainer with dark flecks, caked within its mesh, and a folded letter, the seal broken, lying beside it. "It is the luncheon," Marianne stammered when she found him. "The tea, Madame's tea." She did not drink it. It was prepared as always. The first sip she felt ill, and then she saw the flecks. The letter, monsieur, was addressed to Miss Eleanor. It was not there when she went to her room. Now it is, and the seal is broken. Poirot's expression did not shift in haste. He took the strainer with the careful reverence of a man handling a relic, and then, with a quick, secret movement, placed a small piece of the letter in his pocket. "We will speak with Lady Agatha," he said calmly. "Hastings, you, with Miss Eleanor." There's another current. The letter, when unfolded, contained a brief note in a hand that was hurried but legible. It read, in part, "If you speak of the will, you will suffer. There are those who will not allow the truth to break free without price. Be wise. Keep silent, or the consequence will be regretted." There was no signature. The threat, though vague, carried the weight of someone certain of knowledge and yet unwilling to implicate themselves openly. An attempt at intimidation threaded with the assumption of control. Lady Agatha had indeed felt a sudden faintness at the luncheon, a chill that started at the base of her skull and radiated outward, and she had refused the second cup, insisting, with a composure that masked fear, that the first had simply been too strong. The flecks in the strainer, when Poirot examined them later with a small magnifying glass, were of a powdery substance to find to be merely grounds. It clung to the metal like a stealthy residue. He did not, in that moment, label it poison, but the suggestion of something tampered with hung in the room like a damp mist. It was the kind of subtle act that did not kill outright, but whispered that a larger hand was moving and that someone had miscalculated the limits of what could be done without drawing attention. Miss Eleanor, brought in when I delivered the news, took the letter with fingers that trembled slightly, then smoothed it as if to iron out the thread itself. "Who would do this?" she asked, voice barely above a careful breath. "To me, too, mother. We are already under scrutiny. To add fear, it is to push us into mistakes. Fear is a skilled companion of those who wish to control," Poirot murmured, his gaze softening, "not as comfort but as a reminder. It tells a person to shrink, to hide. It also, if watched, tells us where the map of intention lies. Who fears the light enough to shade it?" Dr. Mead, called upon to examine Lady Agatha, was cautious in his assessment. He attributed the fainting to nervous strain, though he admitted the presence of the flecks warranted further observation. "It is not typical," he told Poirot quietly. "It is deliberate. The person wished to make her feel sick, yes, but not to kill. It is a step, a warning, or a test." Colonel Prentice, who had been listening from the doorway, grunted. "So now there is not only the broken cup and the missing page, but a threat. The mind behind this is not satisfied with confusion. It wishes control." "Control," Poirot repeated, turning the word over like a small trinket. "Control is the believability of the story. If one cannot place the pieces of the past as one wishes, one can apply pressure to the present to reshape the telling. But the letter, who wrote it? That is the question. It is someone who knows the playing field enough to threaten, and yet their signature is missing. They do not wish to be traced, but they wish the fear to be felt. Mr. Swan, still under the cloud of the earlier accusation, returned to the drawing room in a quiet state of indignation. He had, according to Inspector Larner, been released from temporary custody pending further investigation, but the new development pulled him back into the vortex. "This is no coincidence," he said when he was made aware of the letter. "Someone is escalating. Either the true hand is annoyed that the wrong one was accused, or the play is being refined, or," Poirot said mildly, "the person who sent the letter wishes to see how the puppet strings pull when another is nearly cut. The act of threatening suggests a nervousness, someone who wants to push, but is afraid to commit fully. That is a measure. We will watch how the reaction is managed. The person who fears exposure tends to push others into a corner to see if they will break first." The mood of the house shifted yet again. The secondary disturbance was not as blatant as the first, but it was more intimate, an invasion of private correspondence. A question whispered through the quiet of what had seemed settled. Suspicion rewove itself. Alliances recalibrated, not openly, but like the shifting of weights beneath the surface. Miss Eleanor read the note again and again, as if the repeated reading might uncover something missed, some trace left by the writer's hand that would betray them. Poirot, for his part, did not speak of conclusions. He had begun to assemble the new threads. The letter was both a warning and a mirror. It showed who believed they could intimidate, and who, in receiving the intimidation, might be compelled to act in ways that revealed more than they intended. He sat quietly, letting the others display their unease, letting the new mystery fold into the old, becoming not a replacement, but a layer, one more shade in the complex pattern that, when viewed wholly, would, he hoped, reflect the truth. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. Secondary Disturbance. The letter and the near poisoning had the peculiar effect of pulling threads taut. In doing so, it revealed the hidden weave beneath those connections not obvious at first glance, those loyalties and resentments stitched in quiet corners. Poirot, who was never satisfied with surface explanations, began to trace these threads, not with accusation, but with gentle, precise questions that caused links to surface like submerged stones catching light. He began with the matter of Mr. Carmichael, the outsider whose inclusion in the will had prickled the sensibilities of the house. Lady Agatha had spoken of his loyalty without claim, but nothing in her recounting touched the shape of his true influence. It was Miss Eleanor, in a private moment with Poirot, who unwittingly released the first bit of context. "You asked who benefits from silence," she said, her voice lower now, the earlier unease settling into a restless clarity. "My father once spoke of Mr. Carmichael as someone who understood being invisible. He was a broker of things that should not be seen, not in the criminal sense, but in the sense of being the keeper of quiet debts. He helped settle accounts that would have ruined reputations. Not money always, favors, secrets." "Ah," Poirot murmured, his fingers steepled. "So the outsider had a history here, yes? Not of family, but of maintenance. He tended things that families preferred not to speak of." "Yes, father trusted him because he knew how to make difficult disappear. That is perhaps why he thought to include him, because he believed Mr. Carmichael could smooth what had been jagged. And yet," Poirot added quietly, "a person who smooths also sees what is beneath the surface. He is not blind to the structure of the house, and he knows the weaknesses in the plaster. That knowledge is a connection, and knowledge can be leverage." We stepped back into the drawing room, where Dr. Meade and Colonel Prentice were deep in conversation over the now increasingly complicated map of relationships. It was Dr. Meade who offered something to Poirot that at first seemed a small observation. Lord Fenwick and the Colonel had more than a neighborly respect, he said, almost as an aside. There were times when Prentice advised on philanthropic distributions, and Fenwick deferred. There was one episode last autumn when a public donation was quietly redirected, after the colonel suggested a different recipient. Citing the greater good, Fenwick's acceptance then had been, I thought at the time, more reluctant than sincere. Colonel Prentice's face, which had been composed, gave a flicker of discomfort, a micro-movement that Poirot detected as easily as a change in tone. Circumstances change, he replied with measured calm. The idea was to preserve stability. Stability, Poirot repeated softly, sometimes requires rewriting the past in the quiet, non? If you suggest a change, and the one who holds means consents reluctantly, there's a trace of influence no matter the intention. Influence is a connection. It is gentle, but persistent. Then came the financial tie that I had not understood until Poirot pointed it out. With that ease of combination that seemed so natural to him, Mr. Swan, despite the cloud of the earlier accusation, had remained connected in ways not merely professional. He had invested, indirectly, through a third party, in one of Lady Agatha's lesser-known ventures, a small foundation, intended to preserve a crumbling estate in the north, a venture that had recently run into difficulties. The foundation's manager had been vague in his reports. The money flow had paused, and yet the cause had been upheld publicly by Lady Agatha, who insisted all was well. It is not that Mr. Swan benefits directly, Poirot told me in passing, but networks overlap. When one lends narrative credibility to a failing project, and another has a stake in its rehabilitation, there's unspoken pressure. You help me make the story true. I help you keep the story favorable. The foundation is a thread connecting the public face to private stabilization. Poirot also followed the quieter, emotional connections. Lady Agatha and Dr. Meade shared something beyond professional courtesy. He had been her confidant regarding Lord Fenwick's states of mind, but occasionally, in his reports, he had couched her worries in terms that seemed to soothe not just the patient, but the one who tended the patient. I noticed, as Poirot inclined his head one evening before dinner, the way she asked questions that bordered on personal questions about his own resiliency, his own burdens softly embedded beneath the guise of medical curiosity. There's an undertone of shared anxiety, Poirot observed to me. When the caregiver becomes companion, the line between counsel and influence thins. That influence is not necessarily malice, but it is connection. And when the house is unsettled, connections that were previously supportive can become paths for pressure. Miss Eleanor's relation to Mr. Carmichael was further complicated by a childhood moment. Poirot coaxed out with delicate prodding. She had been sent once, as a child, to deliver a message to him, a small parcel of pressed flowers and a note of thanks. He had, in return, taken time to speak to her about the nature of silence, teaching her, with a kindly but deliberate charm, how secrets could be stores of power if held too tightly. She had not realized then that what was given was a lesson, and what was received a seed of awareness. That connection, subtle, had left its mark in the way Eleanor watched the room, always assessing. All these strands, financial, emotional, advisory, and historical, formed a lattice that was intricate. No one person stood unconnected. Some bonds were visible, others were the thin, almost translucent threads that become apparent only when another tension pulls them taut. Poirot, as he gathered these, did not yet name their direction. He merely kept them in his mind's quiet file, letting each intersection sit, waiting for the moment when the pattern would demand to be read fully. Chapter 10. Poirot's secret clue for days. The surface of the case had been raked and re-raked, each layer of distraction designed to look more like a solution, each new twist adding weight to the familiar. Poirot, however, had been carrying with him a small, quiet thing, a fragment of a truth so subtle that it could have been lost in the noise of louder revelations. He did not mention it aloud. He allowed the others to speak, to accuse, to reassure themselves, while he cradled it like a precious, delicate instrument, waiting for the precise moment to tune it. It was during the third day of questioning, while Mr. Swan was still smarting from the earlier accusation, and the household rehearsed their narratives, that the clue made itself undeniable to Poirot. Not explosive, not a shining gem, but a hairline fissure in the structure of assumed intention. We were in the library again, that room which had become a theater of examination. Poirot had asked for the teacup fragments to be brought out once more, and while I was turning the pieces in my hands, he said to me without looking up, "Hastings, attention." He pointed, with the clever little tilt of his head, to the pattern interrupted by the break. "See here," he murmured. "The blue vine is painted in a continuous sweep. The break was made after the last brush, yes? But look at the interior on the underside of this fragment." He turned it so the light caught a faint, almost invisible smudge, a shadow of something that had been, at first glance, merely the residue of handling. Poirot held it to his nose. "It is not only dust. There's the scent of lavender, delicate, almost imperceptible. That is not from the room. It is from the hand that placed it. The person who positioned the cup did not move with haste. They placed it as one sets a thing with care, and yet wanted it to appear accidental. The contradiction cared for clumsiness. It points to someone who knows the value of appearances," I said, deliberate yet wanting it to be believed they were careless. But the small piece is not the whole." He slid the fragment into a small case. "The real pleasure is here." He walked to the writing desk and opened the top drawer, locked, as before, but now, with permission, the key turned freely. Inside lay a stack of papers, among them earlier drafts, including one that had once been considered and discarded. On that paper, in the margin, was a small notation in Lord Fenwick's regular hand, an abbreviation he used when he revised for clarity, a small flourish that he only made when he felt uncertain about how the change would be perceived by others. Beside it, in a slightly different angle, the same notation appeared, but with a tiny tremor, and the flourished stroke had a faint overlay and attempted imitation. Poirot's eyes, those sharp windows of quiet calculation, rested on that overlay. "Look, Hastings, the imitation is almost perfect. It is a man who has watched, yes, he has studied the mannerisms of the hand, enough to mimic without being exact. He wants us to believe the revision is wholly from Lord Fenwick. Yet the hesitation, the slight shakiness, is not the original. That means influence or coaching, or the insertion of a thought that seemed to come from the deceased, but did not. Someone tried to make the revision appear natural, but failed to hide their own fingerprint of uncertainty," I replied. "So the will's change is not purely an act of the dead man, but shaped, guided by another, exactament." Poirot's little gray cells flickered with a pleasure that was not joyous but satisfied, like the subtle aligning of gears. The person who touched it wanted us to believe it came spontaneously, yet they could not imitate the confidence of the original. That is the secret. They wanted the truth to look like a confession from the past while the present tugged its strings. The broken cup covers the addition. The letter threatens. All these are layers. This, Hastings, is the key to the form of the movement, not the content alone, but who dared to make the content seem as if consented to from beyond, and failed perfectly. He kept the finding close. He said nothing yet to anyone else. Instead, he began altering the rhythm of his questions, not directly, but in the subtext of the interviews that followed. He asked more about who had access to the drafts in the drawer, who had watched the writing sessions, who had noticed any hesitations in Lord Fenwick's own revisions when he had been alive. He did not mention the imitation. He let the suspicion radiate outward like a quiet current, seeing who tensed under the suggestion and who flowed past it. In private, when I pressed him, he said, "The person who imitates without mastery is afraid. They make a show of making the truth appear because they know the real truth is fragile." If they can dress it with the vestige of the past, they feel safer. But safety is an illusion. The tremor betrays the fear. We have the shape of their fear now, Hastings. We will, slowly, apply gentle pressure. The secret clue changed the weight of what had been accepted. It did not yet point, with clarity, to a single culprit. It simply showed that there was an attempt to shepherd the past into the present and influence masked as inheritance. That distinction, minute as a thread but strong like silk, was the fulcrum upon which the entire investigation would pivot. Once Poirot chose to lever it. Chapter 11. Tensions riseth discovery of the imitation. The slight tremor in the margin that betrayed a hand pretending to be another had not been spoken of openly, but its ripples were felt. Poirot had begun to shift the cadence of his inquiries, and although he did not mention the secret clue, the area of pressure had subtly changed. It was as if a new, unseen weight had been placed on certain shoulders, and those who carried it adjusted their stance without acknowledging the load. The household, already frayed by the broken teacup, the missing page, and then the threatening letter, began to behave more like a room of instruments tuned to tightly. Each movement produced a sound that suggested underlying dissonance. Alliances, previously silent, became tentative. Colonel Prentice, who had favored rapid acceptance of the first apparent solution, now spoke with a guarded forcefulness, as though trying to reestablish his own authority over the shifting narrative. "It is not enough to say we were misled," he told Lady Agatha in a quiet corner, his voice carrying more control than comfort. "We must not allow the investigation to fracture the order further. If there is manipulation, let it be exposed, but without throwing the whole house into turmoil." Lady Agatha's reply was measured, but her fingers twisted the envelope containing the threatening letter with a growing rigidity. "Order is what keeps us from falling," she said. "Yet the very people who maintain order seem to be the ones bending it. I do not know whom to trust, Colonel. That is what frightens me." Miss Eleanor, who had been watching from a distance, spoke then, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of someone forced into clarity. "Order is not the same as truth," she said. "If we paper over the cracks to keep the shape, we will only build on rotten foundation. Monsieur Poirot is not making accusations without reason. He makes the unspoken visible, whether we like it or not." Her words were overheard by Dr. Meade, who had joined them under the pretense of offering medical counsel. He exchanged a look with Poirot, a glance that contained the understanding that the slow pressure was beginning to affect the mechanics of the house. He approached Poirot later with a subtle admission. "You pressed me earlier about influence," he said, careful. "The idea of suggestion. In conversations with Lady Agatha, I have felt that her worries were sometimes framed not purely from her own mind, but slightly softened. She confides, and then the words come back to me as guidance. I did not think much of it, but now," he paused. "Now I see how those gentle shadings could become reinforcement. Not overt, but there, reinforcement becomes a path," Poirot murmured. "One does not notice a road when it is smooth. One notices when it leads to a place one did not intend to go." The tensions are rising because those who believe themselves distinct begin to feel the pull of connections. They adjust, some with honesty, some with performance. Mr. Swan, whose earlier accusation had placed him at the center of the storm, returned to the drawing room with a defiant air that masked something more brittle beneath. He had been given the freedom to come and go for the moment, but the shadow of suspicion clung like a faint scent. He sought out Lady Agatha and spoke in a voice that was, to my ear, slightly different, not the easy cadence of a storyteller, but the sharpness of one feeling the walls close. "You do not see," he said quietly, "that the ease with which you accepted the first conclusion, that it suited the narrative, makes the narrative suspect. The real cunning does not shout. It arranges the stage for the shout to be believed. I am no longer sure who is playing whom." Miss Eleanor overhearing, did not answer. But I saw the brief flicker of defiance that passed across her face. She turned then toward Poirot, not for comfort, but for confirmation that the unease she felt had a shape that could be trusted. Poirot, in his calm, took the moment like a conductor feeling the tremor of a solo before allowing it to swell. He spoke not directly to any single person, but in a way that the tension could not ignore. When the surface is calm, and beneath it the current moves faster, it is the ones who speak of order without listening who are most at risk of being wrong. The truth resists the quick. Those who wish it to remain hidden seek to control the narrative, because they fear the ripple becoming a wave. There were moments, too, when the tension produced unlikely confessions not of guilt, but of small concessions. Lady Agatha admitted, in a subdued tone to Poirot alone, that she had been uncertain whether the addition to the will had been appropriate in its timing. He wanted to do something, she said, and I believed in the intention rather than the implication. If I had known the shape of the consequence, perhaps I would have made him wait. And you? Poirot asked gently. Did you feel pressure? From whom? She hesitated, then shook her head slightly, the movement ambiguous. From the past, she said. From what we owe, from what we have left unsaid. That night, the dinner was strained. Conversations were clipped, and the silence between them was sharpened by the awareness that eyes visible and invisible were watching the way they moved, the way they chose words. Colonel Prentice attempted to assert calm. Dr. Meade became more reserved in his medical counsel, and even Mr. Blythe, who had been careful from the beginning, carried himself with a slight stiffness, as though he sensed that the game had telescoped to a point where the stakes were no longer merely about evidence, but about the very integrity of what everyone believed to be true. In the quiet of my own thoughts, I saw the outcome of these rising tensions. They were not yet breaking anyone. They were not yet causing fractures wide enough for the whole truth to tumble through, but they had made the house less certain, and uncertainty, Poirot always said, was a revealing thing. It forced movement, and movement, in its turn, showed the edges of the hidden. Chapter 12. The confrontation's day unfolded like a taut string being plucked, each note vibrating with the tension Poirot had so carefully cultivated. He had chosen his moment with that quiet deliberation of a man who knows exactly how much pressure a surface can take before it gives. The confrontation was not public. It was not dramatic in the overt sense. It was intimate, precise, the kind that pries a fissure open by asking the right question at the right angle. Dr. Percival Meade was the one called into the small study that afternoon. He arrived with the courteous air of a man who believed himself composed, his thoughts arranged in the neat rows of a professional mind. Poirot had placed a decanter of brandy on the side table and 2 glasses. He poured a small measure for the doctor under the pretense of hospitality, and I was left outside with the pretense of giving them privacy, though Poirot had asked me to remain within earshot. For the music, he said. Doctor, Poirot began in his softest tone, you are a man of observation. You watch, you frame, you interpret. You have spoken of influence. You have spoken of suggestion. Let us speak of the will's revision again. You told me once that a man can convince himself of a correction because he has been comforted into believing the desire was his own. That is a subtle thing. Nest's pause, a seed that feels like birthright. Dr. Meade's fingers tightened around the stem of the glass. You suggest. I suggest nothing, mon ami. I am asking, who in your conversations with Lady Agatha whispered the nature of the change with tenderness? Did you feel that sometimes her suggestions were softened for you, perhaps because she feared the bluntness of truth? Did she, perhaps, pass to you what she believed to be her thought, and you, being a man of care, refined it back, making it safer? You see how the smoothing can become shaping. Meade's mouth pressed into a thin line. I am a physician. I advise on health. She came to me concerned for her husband's unrest. I listened. I gave counsel. If that counsel was interpreted as shaping, then I am sorry. I did not intend to influence beyond healing. Poirot's eyes, small bright dots of assessment, held his. Ah, but healing has edges, does it not? One can heal a wound, and in the same movement, cause a scar that alters the shape beneath. Lord Fenwick's amendment. Did you ever suggest that perhaps the addition be phrased to seem less radical, that the wording of guilt be softened, that the anxiety he felt be made more palatable, so the acceptance would come easier? Dr. Mead started. I might have advised clarity. A man wrestles with his conscience. Clarity helps him sleep, and clarity, when given with a certain tone, becomes permission. Poirot said gently, you recall the imitation in the margin, the one that tries to echo his flourish but trembles. A man who is guided, perhaps, to add something, and then believes it to have been his own thought would attempt to make the change seem natural, yes? And the hand that attempts to imitate without mastery leaves the tremor. That tremor is not his, is the leftover of someone who has been prodded, reassured, told, you wish to do this. It is right. Mead's face paled slightly, the control slipping as the implication took a shape he had not expected to be pressed into. You think I suggested the addition, he said, and there was a tremor in his voice now, subtle but unmistakable. I know, I only meant to comfort. He was troubled. I said the idea was good because he believed it to be. I did not suggest the content. He chose it. He made the changes. Ah, but you see, you have done what I asked you not to do. You have named a process without naming the actor. You said, I comforted him. I made the idea easier to bear. You have made the idea easier to bear by making him believe he had already decided. That is the fine line between suggestion and direction, yes? And when someone is made to believe their own intent, the truth becomes blurred. I only seek to know, was there a moment when you spoke of who should receive the part of the estate? And did the idea of Mr. Carmichael come with a softening from you? I merely spoke of making amends, Dr. Mead replied, voice firmer now but brittle. Lord Fenwick was guilt-ridden. He spoke of Mr. Carmichael. I said if he wished to correct, he should do so in a way that did not cause scandal, that might be accepted. That is all. Poirot sat back, and for a second the discussion slid into silence, charged and waiting. Then Poirot leaned slightly forward. And Lady Agatha, she has worried, about perception. She wants the past to be forgiven. Did she ever speak to you of how to phrase the amendment so that its truth would be felt, but its shock softened? Did she ever hand you the drafts and ask your opinion not on health, but on how to guide a conscience? Mead's composure, which had been a mask, cracked. She did. She asked if the language could be gentler. She feared the reaction. She feared the way a thing would fall if it were not softened. I did not know then. His eyes flicked, for the briefest moment, toward the door as if seeking an escape from the scrutiny that gentling would be interpreted as shaping. Mon Dieu. Poirot murmured quietly, the thin line has become a path. You have not confessed to a crime, Doctor. You have revealed how the movement was made. That is important. For the person who wishes to guide without being seen, the moment of seeing is dangerous. You see now that gentling can be a companion to influence, yes? The tension rises because that which was private slants into the visible. Dr. Mead's shoulders dropped subtly, a small surrender not of guilt in the overt sense, but of the illusion that his hand had been simply passive. He had made a mistake, a crucial one, by revealing, in trying to defend his intentions, the mechanism by which the will's revision had been given shape. Beyond the deceased's unassisted volition, Poirot did not press further in that room. He had extracted what he needed without causing collapse. It was a delicate victory. He allowed the physician to leave with the suggestion that he reflect on the difference between comfort and counsel. As Mead stepped out, his face was composed again, but his eyes bore the weight of someone who had been seen in a way That did not align with the self-image he had carried later. When I inquired, Poirot said simply, "The person who wishes to hide a shaping behind noble intent often forgets that the shaping leaves. Awake, we have seen the current. Now we know who felt it and how it was carried. The tension, the rising of it is now no longer vague. It has a direction." Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. Heath's rising tension had begun to press on people in different ways. Some internalized it, making their movements more cautious. Others, feeling the walls close, began to act not with dramatic bursts, but with furtive, calculated motions. It was the latter that Poirot anticipated with the quiet certainty of a man who has already heard the whisper before the shout. Early one evening, as dusk settled like a soft curtain over Hartwell, I was in the hallway outside the small servants' pantry, reviewing notes, when I heard the faint rustle of movement beyond the door. It was not loud. It was the sound of paper being handled with too much care, and the quick inhale of someone who believed they were alone. I presumed nothing. Poirot, however, had already placed himself near the top of the stairs with the artful pretense of admiring a portrait. He had said nothing to me, but his fingers, lightly clasped behind his back, betrayed his readiness. A moment later, Marianne, Lady Agatha's maid, the one who had brought the letter of threat, slipped into the pantry, carrying a small bundle wrapped in linen. Her face was pale, her eyes darting like a trapped bird's. She set the bundle on the counter and lit a match with trembling hands. The flame flickered, then caught the corner of the linen. She hesitated, then gathered the papers inside, placing them on a small iron pan. The smell of old paper warmed briefly in the air as she held the bundle over the flames, the heat beginning to blacken the edges. Poirot stepped forward with the smoothness of someone arriving, without announcing himself. "Ah, Marianne," he said softly, not a question, but a placement. "You are burning the past." She started violently, the bundle nearly slipping from her hands. The flame guttered. "Monsieur Poirot," she cried, panic lacing her speech. I had to. I could not bear for her to see it, the letter the way it threatened. I thought if it went, perhaps the fear would go with it. Fear is not burned, ma chère. It is carried, Poirot replied, his voice gentle, but with an edge that made the small sound of her breath catch. He turned, and I saw, just beyond the doorway, the small outline of a second sheeted draft of the will's revision, the imitation in the margin, tucked beneath the pan as if it had been hidden for retrieval. And what is this? A companion to the warning? Marianne's eyes widened. I was to give it back. I thought Lady Agatha asked me to keep things that might upset her quiet. I did not know what to do. The things keep coming. The more I hide, the more there is to hide. Poirot motioned, with a barely perceptible tilt of the head, for me to come closer. He touched the burned edge with the tip of his finger, moving it as if to examine the degree without disturbing further. You see, Hastings, she is desperate. Not because she is guilty, perhaps, but because she believes the coming storm will wash away more than the truth. She wishes to erase what she thinks will hurt the mistress. But the act of destruction is itself a revealing thing. Marianne, I said, in the plain tone reserved for those who serve, what did you see? What made you think burning would help? She bowed her head. The posture of someone who carries the weight of others' secrets as if they were her own. Dr. Mead spoke to me once, she whispered, about how worries can be softened. Lady Agatha told me that change must be gentle. I saw the drafts. I saw the margin that looked like the master's, and then the one that trembled. I thought if she never saw the copy, perhaps she would not have to choose between pride and fear. I burned the first note. The other, she nodded toward the hidden second sheet, I was going to hide. I did not wish you to find it, Monsieur Poirot. I understand, Poirot said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only observation. You have attempted to remove evidence of movement, ma chère. That movement shows not just what was written, but who felt the need to hide it. That is different from the document itself. You have admitted, without knowing it, the anxiety of shaping. The act of hiding is often the attempt to escape the consequence of being seen. But you see, the truth is not like a stain one can scrub away. It leaves a residue, yes? Your attempt to burn has only charred its edges. It shows the panic. He turned to me. We shall keep her for a moment. She is frightened. That fear is useful if watched, not used to break, but to understand what the one who wants to escape fears losing. Marianne, when escorted downstairs to the small connecting room, faltered once, then steadied. She was allowed, at Poirot's gentle insistence, tea. He sat with her, letting her speak herself into a clarity that was less about confession and more about the open, unburdening of a soul misled by good intentions. I watched from the doorway as she began to list, in stuttering fragments, what had been said to her about the letter, about discretion, about influence. Her narrative was tangled, but within the tangles were small telltales, phrases repeated by Lady Agatha, the manner in which Dr. Mead had suggested gentler words, and the way she had believed that hiding could prevent harm. Later, when I asked Poirot about his entrance, he said simply, "The desperate attempt is the sound of someone realizing the current is toward them." Marianne feared the exposure of the shaping. She tried to obliterate it, to cut the thread. Instead, she has given us a new one that shows how the movement was felt by someone close to the softening. We did not need the document fully intact to know its direction. The attempt to destroy has, in a way, preserved its meaning. He kept the remaining fragment of the imitation and the half-charred edges of the first note, carefully sealed. Marianne was not accused. She was protected, softly guided to understand that her attempt to shield had instead made her a witness. The desperate attempt to escape had been thwarted, not by force, but by a recognition so subtle she felt, afterward, oddly relieved, as if the act had allowed her to stop running from the weight she carried. The net, I could see, had tightened, not yet closed, not yet revealing the full fish beneath the surface, but the movement, the rush of panic, the attempt to erase those were signs. Poirot's quiet smile afterward was small, almost invisible. He said, "We will watch how the fear shifts now. The person who wanted to hide will now know they were seen. That changes their next step." Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The aftermath of Marianne's desperate attempt hung like a held breath. The household had shifted subtly. People moved with a new awareness, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. The attempt to erase, to flee from exposure, had not broken anything outright, but it had created a slow, spreading clarity, one that Poirot had been waiting for. The pieces, some jagged, some smoothed by previous hands, began to settle into a configuration that, while not yet complete, took on a sharper outline in his mind. He did not rush. That had become clearer to me. He allowed the tension to rotate, to let those within feel its weight, to see who adjusted and how. Then, as if laying a final, delicate brush stroke on a canvas already rich with color, he gathered certain elements and placed them in a new light. It began with a quiet afternoon walk that he requested with Miss Eleanor. The garden, now more shadowed as the sun leaned toward evening, was the setting. He did not speak of the earlier events directly. He walked, letting her speak of nothing and everything, giving her the space to reveal her own perceptions in unforced ways. "You have watched," he said finally, as they paused by the vervain hedge, "and you have not yet told me everything. The letter, the threat, did it change the way you watched? Did it make the hidden connections sharper or blur them?" "It did both," she answered. "It made me look for obvious danger, and in doing so, I almost missed the quiet hand that moved the strings. The attempt to burn the draft." Marianne's panic showed me that someone feared the shape of what was coming. That fear, I think, pointed not to guilt alone, but to a miscalculation. The person believed the shaping would remain unseen, and when they realized it might be seen, they rushed to silence the evidence. Poirot's small mustaches twitched. The miscalculation is the opening. The one who thinks their shaping is invisible will make the most expressive mistake. When they sense the possibility of exposure, they will not flee in the obvious way. They will act to protect their process. The frightened flame is different from the desperate flight. He paused, letting the idea settle as if depositing a seed. The final piece, Mademoiselle, is not a single document nor a single act. It is the moment when the weight of continued concealment becomes heavier than the risk of the truth. We are near that moment. You have seen the way those around you circle their own intentions. You know the feel of the pull. Keep watching. Do not speak yet. Let the person who shaped the past feel the subtle pressure of the present from there. Poirot turned to Colonel Prentice with a different sort of engagement. He invited him to examine the study under the pretext of discussing the imprudence of burning potential evidence. The colonel, perhaps seeking to reassert his own grasp on order, agreed with a stiffness that betrayed both his desire and his discomfort. "Colonel," Poirot began, "you once suggested that the spectacle was meant to cover the whisper. Now we have seen the whisper being tended, softened, hidden, then threatened, and finally almost erased. The final piece is understanding who benefits from the shape staying as it is, and who fears its alteration." Prentice had the grace to look slightly taken. The benefit of stability is clear. The fear, yes. The fear is of the truth causing upheaval. But you wish to know whose hand tends the whisper. Yes, we, Poirot replied, not so much for the hand itself as for the intention behind the tending. When one has shaped something believing it to be a kind mercy, and then is forced to see it through the eyes of another, the reaction is telling. The person who wishes to preserve their shaping will act differently from the one who merely accepted its existence. Observe the change in how they speak about it. Meanwhile, the new kernel of clarity reached Lady Agatha. She had been carrying the weight of earlier decisions with a kind of quiet fatigue, tightening her grasp on the semblance of order while feeling the internal quake beneath. Poirot, with the gentleness of someone shepherding a frightened animal rather than prompting a confession, invited her for tea. He spoke of the duality of intention and perception, of how the same act can be both a kindness and a chain. "You have been generous with kindness, madam," he said, "but the shape of that kindness has shadowed others. The final piece is not that you wished to make amends. It is that you wished to make amends in such a way that the act became invisible. And when it was felt, you attempted to soften it before the world could see it raw. The person who shaped the revision and the one who made it appear natural. That is the heart of the movement. Do you feel the pressure of the difference?" She pressed her lips together. "I wanted to do right," she whispered, "without causing ruin. I thought if the truth was arranged gently, it would be accepted. I did not anticipate the fear would twist it into something that felt like manipulation instead of mercy. That is why the final piece is delicate," Poirot said, "because the line between intention and perception is thin. When the person who made the shaping feels the possibility of exposure, they act to protect, to adjust, to hide. That action is the last movement before the truth is audible." As the day waned, the smaller tensions coalesced into a quiet pressure. The clues, once scattered like tiny stars, were beginning to form constellations. Poirot did not yet pull them into a full explanation. Instead, he held the shape gently in his mind, aware that the final piece once placed would allow him to shift everything. From murmur to revelation, the little gray cells were no longer merely warming. They were poised. Chapter 15. The final gathereth date chosen for the gathering arrived with a weight that was almost palpable. Hartwell's high-ceilinged drawing room had been arranged with a precision that betrayed Poirot's hand. Nothing ostentatious, nothing theatrical, yet everything placed so that no one could shift without being seen. The suspects Lady Agatha, Miss Eleanor, Dr. Mead, Colonel Prentice, Mr. Swan, Mr. Blythe were all present, and even Inspector Larner. Drawn back into the fold by the shifting tides, set near the doorway, there was no grand announcement. Poirot's invitation had been simple: come together. The time has arrived to see what the little gray cells have been whispering. They came, and each carried with them the residue of the tensions, the recent concealments, the uneasy recalibrations. Poirot stood by the fireplace, his posture calm, fingers clasped, the faintest shadow of a smile resting at the corner of his lips. He did not begin with the accusation. He began with a story, one that wound around their own behaviors, coaxing the truth closer not by force, but by showing how it had already presented itself in fragments. You have all been part of a house with a rhythm, he began, a rhythm that was interrupted. The interruption was, in the beginning, a broken cup and a missing page. Then there came a whisper threat and a hiding. These things, taken alone, are small. Together, they form a dance. The person who leads a dance does not always make the loudest step. Often, it is the one who adjusts the music softly and watches how the others move. He looked first at Lady Agatha. Madam, you wished to right a wrong. That is commendable. You wished it to be seen as a thing of mercy, not a scandal. You asked for the shaping to be gentle, to make the amendment feel as if it came from the past itself, accepted, not forced. You feared the sharpness of truth, and so you softened. That softness, when given to another, becomes guidance. The guidance, when repeated, becomes shape. The shape, when believed, is then presented as natural. You felt the need to protect the intention from being misunderstood, and thus you, unknowingly, crafted the first veil. He turned then to Dr. Mead. Doctor, you are a healer. A healer takes pain and makes it bearable. You were asked to make the amendment palatable. You gave solace to a troubled conscience. That solace became the channel by which an idea already present was reinforced, made easier to accept. The one who is comforted believes the decision their own, and so the act moves, not under the weight of imposition, but under the appearance of volition. That is subtle influence, yes? And when one attempts to imitate the hand of the past without mastery, the tremor appears. The imitation that was intended to cloak guidance exposed it instead. Miss Eleanor listened, her expression composed but the tension around her eyes softening in a way that suggested understanding, not surprise. Poirot continued, shifting the light with his voice toward the others. Colonel Prentice, he went on, you sought order, and in that desire you accepted what appeared clear too soon. The first false lead and easy villain was a comfort. The comfort of closure is seductive, and when the pattern of distraction is potent, it draws even the vigilant into its embrace. Your suggestion of noise-covering whisper was nearly correct, but you did not see who tended the whisper, and so you mistook the direction of the current. He paused, letting the words find their place like pieces laid around an object before the lid is closed. Then, with a slight shift, he turned to Mr. Swan. Monsieur Swan, you are a teller of lives. You understand how to shape narrative, and that gives you both insight and vulnerability. You were placed in the center because you appeared convenient. Convenience, when accepted without probing, becomes a story people prefer. You felt the net. You resisted. That resistance made you slippery, and so you were used as a visible piece while the true movement remained behind. Mr. Blythe's eyes flicked, just slightly, as Poirot approached the last part. And you, Blythe, know the rhythm. You felt hesitation where there was pause, and you saw concealment where there was fear. The attempt to burn the draft Marianne's action revealed panic. Panic is not guilt, but it is reaction. She was not the author of the shaping. She was the carrier of its weight, and in trying to remove it, she showed us the direction from which the burden came. The room had gone quiet, but not stunned. Each person was digesting something that had been said in fragments. before threads pulled together into a clearer pattern, yet with the core still held like a jewel in shadow. Poirot was not finished. He leaned slightly forward. "There's one more piece," he said, looking over them all. "The person who arranged the noise, the shaping, and the softening believed themselves to be invisible. They believed that by making the truth appear gentle, by placing it under the guise of the past, and by letting others accept the easy villain, they would control the story. They miscalculated the tension of exposure. They felt the pressure rise. That pressure caused a panic and attempt to erase, to hide, to make the evidence vanish. That attempt has done us a favor. It has shown where the fear runs, and fear runs toward the place where the truth has been kept." He let the sentence hang, like a breath held on the verge of release, not yet naming the outcome, but making clear that the gathering was more than a staging for confession. It was the moment before the reveal where the assembled could feel the shape of what was coming, see the final movement in the air, and understand that the truth, while not yet fully uttered, had a gravity from which there was no escape. Chapter 16. The reveal. Poirot's voice, which earlier had wound like a slow current beneath conversation, now carried the crisp clarity of someone who had drawn the final line in chalk and was ready to lift the cloth. There was a stillness in the room, as if the very air waited for the moment when the carefully arranged pattern would at last disclose its center. "You have all felt the pressure," he began, looking over them with that knowing patience of his. "You have all adjusted, resisted, feared, and protected. The truth has been in pieces, and I have allowed those pieces to move, to settle, to reveal their edges. Now I will speak the whole." He turned first to Lady Agatha. "Madam, you wished to undo injury. Your husband's secret friendship with Mr. Carmichael was something you knew could bruise the visible order, and so you chose to make the amendment appear as if it had come from the past, that it was his own redress. You enlisted the kindness of Dr. Mead not merely to soothe the conscience, but to make the change tolerable. You asked for the wording to be softened, so that the shock would not fracture the family. He, being a man of care, framed that softness into guidance, and you believed the movement to be natural. That is the shaping." Lady Agatha's hands folded tightly in her lap. You wanted to correct without scandal," Poirot finished gently. "Yes, but intention is not the same as effect. You feared exposure so much that, when pressure rose, when the possibility of your shaping being seen became real, you acted in panic. You sent the letter to Miss Eleanor, threatening in vague terms to frighten her into silence, not realizing the effect would bring her closer to you in alarm, making her a watcher instead of a shield. That was your first miscalculation. Then, fearing the drafts themselves, you asked Marianne to conceal what might expose the manner of the amendment. Marianne, frightened, attempted to burn the evidence. That desperate attempt, madam, was your fatal mistake, not in the shaping, but in the attempt to erase the trace. In doing so, you forced the truth into the light by making those around feel the tremor of concealment." Miss Eleanor's mouth parted, and then she closed it, eyes traveling between her mother and Poirot with the slow dawning of recognition. Dr. Mead, who had listened with a composure now frayed at the edges, looked down, his professional certainty shaken by the clarity of the mapping. Poirot continued, drawing the circle tighter. "You used Mr. Swan as a convenient noise. His presence, his interest in memoirs, his understanding of narrative, these were tools placed slightly to the side to attract attention while the real movement was refined behind. You allowed him to be the apparent villain because you knew the ease with which closure would be accepted. That was the second miscalculation. You believed in control, but control softens into exposure when it is too carefully hidden." Lady Agatha's eyes filled with a quiet desperation. "I did not set out to harm anyone. I only wanted to make it right, and right has edges, madam," Poirot said, not unkindly but with the firmness of truth. "The person who shapes without letting the world know the shaping risks making mercy look like manipulation. He turned, then, and looked squarely at Dr. Mead. "Doctor, you believed you were merely comforting. You gave language that made acceptance easier. That is why the imitation in the margin trembled. The man who wrote the revision felt his idea supported, and thus believed it his own. When imitation was attempted by someone who had watched that movement, and sought to make it appear entirely of the past, the uncertainty betrayed the presence of the shaping. Your role was not criminal in intention, but vital in execution. You smoothed the path, and so the path was mistaken for the beginning of the journey." Dr. Mead swallowed. "I thought I was helping. You were, until the helping became hidden direction. The difference is in what is known and what is assumed. You saw too late that the genling was not merely comfort, but a channel." Poirot's gaze swept the room, now landing with a quiet finality on Colonel Prentice. "And you, Colonel, were quick to embrace the obvious villain to restore order, not seeing that the order you defended had been subtly rewritten. Your acceptance of convenience allowed the false lead to breathe." The Colonel's face tightened, but he said nothing. Finally, Poirot faced the assembled group, letting the quiet settle before delivering the closing stroke. "The fatal mistake, madam, was believing that shaping the past and hiding the shaping would protect the intention. Instead, it gave rise to fear, and fear makes movement. That movement compelled Marianne to act in panic, which gave us the direction. You see, the truth does not need to be forced when the person hiding it believes themselves clever enough to erase all traces. They only need to be shown their own missteps." Lady Agatha's composure broke. She looked toward her daughter, then at Dr. Mead. "It was to protect you all," she whispered. "I thought if I smoothed it, no one would be hurt. I did not think the smoothing would become a burden that needed hiding." Miss Eleanor rose, her posture steady now, the tension in her earlier unease replaced by something like quiet resolve. "You made a choice, Mother, a choice that involved others without their full knowledge. The truth might be ugly, but the attempt to hide it made it worse." Poirot nodded slightly. "And so, the story is told. The shaping, the imitation, the distraction, the panic. The threat each was a layer to a central purpose. The real beneficiary, Mr. Carmichael, was not the point of scandal, but the instrument of balance. My lady saw it. The one who is wronged now is the order you believed you preserved. The consequences will be decided, but your confession, when it comes, will be not of malice, but of misjudged mercy." He turned to Inspector Larner, who had sat in silence, absorbing the unraveling with the measured patience of a man trained to wait for the final note. "Inspector, the person responsible for the sequence is before you. The motive was correction, the method a concealment of that correction. It is time for the outcome." Silence settled again, this time not as tension, but as resignation, the kind that follows the lifting of a veil. The culprit's fatal mistake had been not the initial wish to amend, but the attempt to keep the amendment invisible, to control perception so tightly that when the pressure rose, panic exposed the very shaping she had hoped to hide. Chapter 17, Outcome. And Justiceth room held a silence that was not empty. It was dense with the weight of consequences, the quiet after the unmasking of a carefully constructed illusion. Lady Agatha sat back, her fingers unconsciously tracing the seam of her glove, as if feeling where the world had shifted beneath her touch. Miss Eleanor stood with a composed steadiness, her gaze calm but unforgiving. Dr. Mead's posture remained upright, though the lines around his mouth had deepened. Colonel Prentice's eyes flicked from one face to another, seeking a steadiness that order no longer supplied. Mr. Swan watched with a blend of vindication and wariness. Inspector Larner, who had listened with the official's trained patience, now rose. "You will come with me, Lady Agatha Fenwick," he said, his voice formal, but not unkind. "There are statements to be taken, and the matter of the threatened letter must be included. The shaping of the will, the concealment, The attempt to erase these are all part of a chain that the law will interpret in its own way. Lady Agatha's hands, which had been still, now trembled barely. She looked at her daughter, and there was a moment brief, charged where the distance between them seemed both measured and raw. Then she rose slowly. "I will tell you everything," she said, her voice small and controlled. "It was never to harm. It was to protect. I see now how the protection became the prison." Miss Eleanor did not step forward to stop her. She only inclined her head slightly, an acknowledgement that the confession was not the end, but a necessary turning. Dr. Mead approached as well, not to offer solace, but to clarify. "My involvement will be explained," he said. "I was not the architect. I was the one who, through comfort, gave momentum. I accept that mine was not a neutral hand." Poirot listened, his face composed, the little gray cells having turned the mechanism of truth into its current form. "Justice," he said quietly, "to no one in particular, is not only in punishment, it is in the reckoning. The one who shapes with love must face the outcome of that shaping. The one who softens must understand when gentle becomes hidden. That is part of restoring order greater than the surface. The net must be mended, and the cost is sometimes not small." Inspector Larner, making his own notes, looked toward Colonel Prentice. "And you, Colonel, your acceptance of the easy solution, will you make a statement about your haste?" Prentice's jaw tightened. "I will," he replied. "Order can mislead as easily as it can guide. I was too quick to take comfort." Mr. Swan took his own stand, not as the accused, but as a man whose reputation had nearly been used as a prop. "I was a convenient noise," he said, "and you used that convenience. I will correct the record. The story I tell will bear the truth of what was done to me." His eyes flicked briefly to Miss Eleanor. "And the ease with which you accepted the shaping of narratives, be careful. You, too, are part of the web of how things look." Marianne, who had been quietly sitting to the side, was brought forward. Poirot had insisted she be treated not as a conspirator, but as someone manipulated by fear. "You did not burn to hide guilt," Poirot said, turning to her, "but to protect. That distinction will be noted. You will tell what you saw, what you were told, and that will help untangle the rest of the knot." She nodded, eyes wide, her voice small as she began. "I thought I could keep it safe. I thought if I removed it, the pain would go. I see now that hiding only made the truth louder. The formalities began, statements taken. Confessions shaped not in theatrical emotion, but in quiet, fractured explanations. Lady Agatha did not attempt to obfuscate. She spoke of the secret meetings, the consultations with Dr. Mead, the fear of scandal, the attempt to soften, then to protect. She admitted to sending the threatening letter, a cowardly act born of panic rather than malice, intending to silence her daughter's questions before they could widen into suspicion. She admitted to asking Marianne to conceal drafts, believing concealment to be a kindness. Dr. Mead admitted that his counsel crossed into shaping, a crossing he had not seen until the outcome made it clear. Inspector Larner considered the chain benevolent intention, manipulation of perception, attempted concealment, threat, and panic. It was not a simple crime of greed or malice, but a complex misdeed that blurred the lines between mercy and control. He would, in his report, describe it as a tragic unfolding of human frailty and attempt to safeguard something precious that backfired under the weight of secrecy. The law would take its course, but there would be judgment not only of acts, but of context, and as Poirot had intimated, of the quiet culpability of those who had once sought quick order. Later, when the formalities had dwindled and the household had been sent to their rooms to digest the day, Poirot and I sat in the library. The teacup fragments remained, encased now in a small box, the will's pages catalogued. He sipped his tea with that deliberate pause he used when reflecting. "You see, Hastings," he said, "justice is like a recipe. The ingredients are many. Some are bitter, some sweet. If one hides the bitterness under too much sweetness, the dish becomes unbalanced, and the eater is sickened later. Lady Agatha thought to balance. She over-seasoned with concealment. The outcome is not the same as the intent, but it is honest. That is the part that saves a soul from being entirely lost, I suppose, I replied. That Mr. Swan will mend his own story, and Colonel Prentice will be more cautious of easy answers. Poirot inclined his head, and Miss Eleanor will watch more closely still. The net, it is true, has been tightened. The truth has been laid. Now the work of rebuilding begins. There is justice. There is consequence. There is, perhaps, something like relief for those who wish to hide, and for those who wish to uncover. That is the shape of the outcome. Chapter 18. The closing remarked last threads of the affair settled with the slow exhale of a room that had been holding its breath for too long. The household at Hartwell, scarred, but not shattered, began its cautious rearrangement. Lady Agatha retreated for a time from public view, her reputation tempered by the context of intention and the mercy that had curdled into concealment. Dr. Meade remained, the lines of his practice slightly altered, his quiet confidence now carrying the weight of awareness. Colonel Prentice, who had prided himself on order, moved with a touch more hesitation in accepting the easy and the obvious. Mr. Swan, with his narrative clarified, took steps to restore the balance between the story told and the story lived. Miss Eleanor stood between the past and future with a steadier grip on both. The revelation had made her less naive, not cold or sharp-eyed, not embittered. Marianne, no longer a shadow-carrying servant, had been given a sort of gentle absolution, guided to understand that her fear had not made her complicit in malice, only entangled in a haze of misguided protection. The person who had been the pivot, the one whose choice to shape intention into hidden action had created the cascading events, received the consequences with a quiet dignity that spoke of someone who understood, at last, the weight of the mercy that had tipped into manipulation. She was not destroyed. She was remade in the clear light of facing what had been done. Justice, in the way Poirot framed it, had been patient, precise, and above all, humane. The law would write its record. The living would have to rebuild trust, and the ghosts of missteps would linger, not as tormentors, but as cautionary echoes. It was on the morning of departure, in the misty gray that made the park beyond the house shimmer like a memory, that I found Poirot alone by the library window. He was looking out as if the garden held the answer to something beyond the case. His little gray cells quiet now, satisfied but never dull. I took my seat opposite him. The comfortable silence between us lit the closing of a long chapter's last page. It is done. Mon ami, I said. The truth laid bare, the story corrected. And the house, well, it will live. Poirot turned, his mustaches lifting in that small smile which, I have long believed, contains more empathy than any grand speech. We, Hastings, the little gray cells have been working, not to destroy, but to adjust. It is important that one understands the difference. Human beings make mistakes with the best of intentions. That is the cruel part. The good part is that the truth, when it comes, can heal the wound if it is not poisoned by denial. The shaping became poison because the one who shaped feared the bite of exposure. Fear makes even the kindest hands clench. And Miss Eleanor, I asked. She stood very tall today. She is the one who cannot unknow what she has seen. That gives her power, and power is heavy if not tempered. She will watch, yes, but she will also forgive when the right time comes. That is her strength. She has the calm of one who carries knowledge without letting it cloud judgment. He paused, looking again out the window. Mr. Swan will tell his story with care now. He has seen what being convenient can do. Colonel Prentice will not again allow order to be the only lens. Dr. Meade will remember the edge of comfort. Lady Agatha will live with the hum of what was done, perhaps a better keeper of truth, for having tasted the cost of concealment. Mariana, she will not forget how the attempt to erase showed the world the very thing she hoped to hide. She will be kinder to herself. And you? I said, do you ever grow tired of lifting veils? Poirot laughed softly, the sound like a small bell in the quiet room. Tired? None. It is a pleasure, yes, but a serious one. To see the truth come not as a thunderclap, but as the unfolding of a flower. That is why I do it. The satisfaction is not from catching a culprit, Hastings. It is from watching order return to its natural form, not the forced one. A mystery is like a tangled thread. The clever part is not to yank and break it, but to follow the knots until they loosen themselves and allow the path to straighten. He rose, and for a moment I saw him not as the detective with the sharp mind, but as the man who had, in his own manner, offered a kind of mercy. We shall leave now. The house will breathe again. There will be whispers, yes, but they will not have the same weight. I will write my note. The story will be told true. And you, mon ami, will you put it down as another case, or as something more? I will put it down as the time when the little gray cells had to work not only on a puzzle, but on the hearts within it, I replied. That is different. Poirot nodded, a gesture of agreement and acknowledgement. He took his cane, adjusted his coat with the minute precision that seemed to speak of rituals of order, and we walked toward the waiting motor car. As we passed the threshold, he paused, turned, and looked back at the house, its windows catching the pale light, its gardens hushed, and then, with a small flourish that was all his, he said, human nature, mon ami, is the most fascinating of puzzles. And you see, the answer is always the same: love, fear, and the attempt to control both. One must be very careful which is which. I took my seat beside him, and as the car rolled away, Hartwell receded into the soft fog. The affair behind us, the truth ahead, and the little gray cells, ever vigilant, already readying themselves for the next quiet disturbance that would call for their careful touch.